Sounds good.
All right.
You want to do it?
So, last time I know we had a rather dry lecture on corporate structuring and all about different ways of coming up with entities. So just a little bit of a recap. We talked about the three types. We talked about an S Corp, a C Corp, and an LLC. And we said the major difference amongst all of these really came down to taxation benefits. Limited liability was pretty much the same. And then the other was whether or not the benefits would pass through to owners. And the final being that if you're going to fundraise and want to do it effectively, then you really need to set up something like an S Corp or C Corp where you can then create shares. Then we talked a little bit about equity, debt, and assets and what these three things are and how to divvy up equity when it comes to early employees and amongst founders. And then who in here remembers what's so special about the state of Delaware, since we talked extensively about that?
They have like a special court system where you don't go to jury if you have like the corporate lawsuit or something. There's like a better trained judges, and
right.
They kind of have like a more professional.
Right, the Chancery Court. Right. Okay, good. And then we talked about the difference between the board of directors and the board of advisors, and the board of directors being necessary given that you need somebody to keep track of the shareholders' interests in this, but you want to compose your board in such a way that it's not just all about profits and you are able to make progress. And then finally we talked,
Does anyone do board of directors for an LLC, even though it's not required?
Not really. Usually they have some, I think, loose formation of a board. I think that they do have something, but I haven't seen it as formal. With a S Corp or a C Corp, you're meeting once a quarter, you're voting on things. I don't think it's as prevalent, and given that there really aren't shares, there's an equal stake amongst partners, but since there's no shares, there's really not a whole lot of things to be concerned about regarding people outside of the company. Okay, and then we talked last about endgame and the various types of endgames possible, right? There's potentially building this to a point of IPO, initial public offering. Then we talked about potentially getting acquired or licensing out your IP or selling your patents. So these are all different ways in which you can take the technology, the products that you've built, and actually have some sort of goal. So given that we talked a lot about that, today we're going to talk a little bit more about just team building. I know I touched on it a little bit, but before we get into that, let's share a couple announcements because I know people were confused. There is no lab next week. The next lab will be week 7, but you will have some prep work. Because basically the next few lectures are going to set you up for the Lab 3. So in case you guys are wondering, next week we're going to talk a lot about market research. The week after that we're going to talk about customer development. And both of those are going to weave in nicely into when we do the lab. Because the way that the lab is going to work is you're going to need to do all of your work ahead of time and then come and present in lab so that I can give you feedback and you can get feedback from your peers. We'll also do quiz 2 during Lab 7, and then for all of you who are eager to get your quiz 1 results back, those will be in a couple of weeks. We're just waiting for the TA to grade that. So today, all teams should be set in the sense that you should all have a sense of who your partner is going to be. Some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in lecture today is the reason why you should have your team set. And then if you don't still have your teams, well then best of luck to you working on your own. But I would encourage you, like I said, to form some teams. And today's lecture will certainly cover the reasons why. So once again, public service announcements. I got a nice email yesterday saying that there are only 49 days left to apply. And I was actually tempted. I was like, oh, maybe I should start a challenge. But no, I'm not going to. Don't have the time. I'd rather prepare all of you. So once again, I want you guys to take a look at this. And I think what we're going to do, like I said, in the next lab and the weeks coming forward should help you create this summary. And as we get, I'm not going to wait till the last minute, but probably 2 weeks before this, I'll have some office hours where you can start bringing in your summaries for me to look at. So as your teams congeal, start thinking about this. And don't think about it in the sense that you've got to make it to the bitter finish. or you've got to have everything fleshed out, right? Think of it as this is your, once again, sandbox, your opportunity to get up there and talk about an idea that you think is commercializable and get some feedback on it. And much better to do it here rather than in front of a number of investors in the future, right? So get the feedback here from people. I think in the actual startup challenge, there are a few Duke grads who are investors who usually give feedback, so that's really helpful. I know I did something similar to this back in the Bay Area, where it was a Duke Gen event, got up on stage and got a lot of good feedback. So once again, useful for that. Okay, so like I said, we've talked about teams a little bit in the previous lectures, but today I'm going to focus on it completely because, like I said, you all have your team set, and I want you to make sure that you understand how teams operate. And I think a lot of this can also be beneficial since some of you are getting recruited and evaluating companies and evaluating the teams that you're going to be working on. So take some of this, even if not for your startup idea, take it as a personal stake. And I'm also going to talk about the various transitions that they're going to have on a team. So you're going to start off with your small team, and then of course you're going to grow the company, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So the first is, of course, why do we even need a team? What's the reason? Why can't we just go at this alone? And when's the right time to assemble an actual team? And what does the founding team look like as opposed to the team that comes in later on? And then how do we actually manage people and keep them motivated and deal with departures? And the reason I'm bringing all these up, once again, is within your teams, I want you all to think about the various roles that I'm going to talk about and start assigning people based on your conversations who you think could possibly be the CEO or the CTO or who's really great at the business side. And this will go into your final project write-up. So once again, it's all going to weave back together. So I've always said this, right? Many times your idea is good, but it can always be better. And the way in which you're going to make it better is you're going to have some sort of team behind it, right? So the ideas always start with one founder, one person that's very excited about whatever it is, but the innovation is going to happen because you have a team of people that come together. Because oftentimes, we ask this question, why is it that you need the team? Well, once again, you're very limited. You might not feel like you're limited, but you are limited in terms of the skills, the talents, the experience, and the knowledge that you have. And it's not a negative thing. It just is what it is, right? We're not omniscient beings. The other is the more minds that we have, the more different perspectives we have to solve problems. And so I talked a lot about this in the past few lectures about brainstorming, bringing in different perspectives, and then how we can come up with some richer solutions. Right? This is the classic money intelligence versus mint. So, before you rush into assembling a team, though, right? Remember, this was kind of the homework that you had to do before this. You've got to think about the fact that there are some necessary conditions. And the first is that you've got to be committed to an idea if you're the one that's instigating it. Right? If you're not, and you're the person that's joining a team, it's still okay. But you want to think about how your idea is going to translate into a vision. And the reason for this vision is that's what people want to support. That's what people want to build towards. And then you want to think about a long-term plan. What's the roadmap? What is it that we're going to do? Not that we have to commit to it for the next 10 years of our life, but just what's the general direction that we're going in. So, why is it even important to write? Why can't we just bring a bunch of people together that we think are really smart and hire them and, clearly they'll be able to figure things out, right? Well, once again, people join teams because they're ready to build. They don't want to sit around and wait for you to figure out your idea and figure out what it's going to look like. They're very eager to get going and they want to see something actually happen. So we've also talked a lot about these 4 roles. We talked about the entrepreneur, we talked about the innovator, and investor, and the technologist. And the truth is, all these 4 roles are very much interconnected. So I'm going to explain how they all sort of feed off of each other. So the first is, as the innovator, you're the one that's coming up with the novel idea or the product, right? But you're going to be so excited and so passionate that you're not going to think about things like cost and what's the way to market this or sell it to someone else, right? You're just going to be wrapped up in the fact that you think this is the next best thing since sliced bread. And as a result, you also may not know how to scale the technology. So as an innovator, you have certain limitations. Now, the other person is going to be the actual entrepreneur. And this is the person that's typically the CEO, right? Somebody that's going to hold the team together and keep them motivated. A lot of times, an entrepreneur will begin by being an individual contributor, right? They might help build the product. But eventually, it's not really great to hold two roles, meaning having to sit there and do the work and build the product and build a company. So after some time, you actually have to switch, if you're going to be that real CEO, and think about how you're going to manage the day-to-day operations and decisions of the company. And you're going to be the one that's in charge of keeping all the team members together. So that's your primary role. Not being an individual contributor, not writing code, not doing the actual sales. It is initially, but eventually as the company grows, you're going to have to morph your role. Now, the other is you're very, very geared towards success, right? That's kind of your whole mantra. And in order to do that, you have to think about the various perspectives that you're blending together. And by this, I don't mean all the different ideas. I mean, thinking about how an investor would think, thinking about how a customer would think, thinking about what employees want, and being able to put all that together and then come up with some way of being diplomatic and solving everybody's problems or meeting everybody's needs. So the key two things about this then is that you really have to stay focused, and too often entrepreneurs aren't motivated by money, which becomes a little bit of a problem, because at some point you have to be motivated by money, if nothing else, to bring the idea to market and to continue building your business. So a lot of times this becomes a detriment to the success of a company, because the entrepreneur just gets very interested in the idea, but is less interested in actually turning a profit. Now, Anna asked me a really great question yesterday. She's like, well, how do you evaluate investors? What do you look for, right? So here's a little bit of a teaser, and then when we get into fundraising, we'll talk a little bit more. But basically, the things you think about when you think about an investor are, they're going to have a good sense of people. And by that, I don't mean like, oh, so-and-so's nice, right? They're going to have a good sense in that they're going to be able to figure out whether someone is actually capable of building what they say they're capable of, whether they're capable of leading, whether they're capable of growing teams, whether they're capable of scaling technologies. So they really have to get a good sense in terms of the roles of people that they're dealing with. The other is, of course, it's got to be really well connected. And I know in this class, since we're not dealing with investors, it's not as big of a deal, but too often what people do is they just take any money, right, because they're so eager to take money, rather than thinking about taking money from the right person, the one that's going to not only give you the capital to build your idea, but who's also going to bring in the business contacts to then help with sales or help with some sort of strategic partnership. So these are things to evaluate. And this is another reason why a lot of times people will advise you from staying away from taking money from friends and family, right? Because friends and family have a slightly different motivation than someone who understands business dynamics or has a lot of business contacts. Now, obviously they're going to be focused on monetary returns, which is why a lot of times they're going to be impatient, right? These are some of the negatives. They're going to be capitalistic. They're going to be dispassionate, right? That's in complete opposition to an entrepreneur. But they need to obviously, at some point, understand where the entrepreneur is coming from, and the entrepreneur needs to understand where the investor is coming from. So too often when the heads butt, it's because they have this different sense of goals. Now, a lot of investors aren't interested in technical details, but some of them are. So it's not fair to say that they all aren't. The ones who really care about you producing a technology that is novel and indefensible certainly care, but they're not going to want to know all of the nuances, right? They're not going to want to know what your patent says. They're not going to want to know, whether you use some particular type of algorithm to solve it. So the last role is the technologist, right? And we talked about this a little bit. Obviously, they're focused on tech. But this person actually is a little bit of a unique position rather than the other three. And the key is because they're really focused not only on developing the technology, but they want to improve how it operates, right? So it's not enough that they're the innovator, like the innovator comes up with the idea. These are the people that are going to come in and really refine it. Think about how you can make it easier to use, can make it actually sellable, and then they can also think about optimizing it from a cost perspective, right? How can we mass market this? And so once again, this is why I think a few lectures ago I talked about James B. Duke and how someone presented to him with the cigarette machine And he was able to then capitalize on it because he had a grander vision. But that guy just was like, oh, this is a cigarette machine. Like, great, we'll produce 1,000 cigarettes every day. But he didn't know the appeal it could have on the market. So, finally, when we talk about training-oriented, this is something that you all have to think about in your teams. When we say training, we mean that the technologist actually cares about the employees and cares about training them so that they understand what the new technology is that's being built. And the final is that they care about just overall company operations and maintenance. So, once again, these four are very much linked, and they have to operate together, not in opposition, but in harmony, but it takes time to get there. So, these are some obviously classic examples of the different, teams that have done well. And if you think about the big thing is they very much are complementary, right? Steve and Steve were not both engineers. They both had a very different set of skills, and they were able to use that. So as you're formulating your teams and working together, think about the things that you know particularly well that someone else doesn't, and what your partner might know better than you, right? And use that to your benefit. So the reason that we talk a lot about team dynamics is because fundamentally, it's the backgrounds and the personalities of the individuals that are on that founding team that really set the culture, right? A lot of people ask this question like, oh, what determines culture of a company, and how can you tell what it is? Well, it comes back to what the founding team, the people on it, the way that they interact, the values that they set forth, how they treat each other. And that basically then gets emulated by all the employees and everyone else in the company. So this is why it's really important to kind of set a foundation. Now, in your groups, you're not going to have a bunch of employees that you're dealing with, but something to think about. And if you ever want to know why certain company cultures are the way that they are, it comes back to the way that the founders are. So, once again, I'm just going to keep reiterating this. Understand your strengths, your partner's strengths, as well as weaknesses. Not because you're going to be like, hey, you suck at this, but hey, let's figure out how we can bring somebody else to work on this project if you and I aren't particularly good at this. So, the key in all of this is communication, right? And as you're getting ready to do your labs, and even when you start doing your final projects, one of the things that you're going to have to do, just to give you a teaser, is you will have to explain to me what your particular teammates' strengths and weaknesses are that you identified. Right? It'll be a really great way for you to figure out how to recruit people in the past. So if you didn't get to know them very well in the course of the project, they'll become very evident. And if you don't have a partner, then you're going to have to do a self-analysis and figure out for yourself, what it is that you did particularly well and what you didn't, and possibly how someone else could have helped you. So, a lot of times technologists ask themselves this question then, well, if I'm so smart, right, I know all these things, I'm capable of cost reduction, I'm capable of selling a technology, I'm capable of training people, why do I even need to bring in outside folks to help out? Not just the founding team, but outside perspectives. Well, the reason is because, once again, even a technologist, even the best ones aren't omniscient, right? They will not necessarily know all the details of a technology, and they're going to need to get some outside assistance. The other thing is that these nuances can actually spell the success or failure of a company, right? So think about a lot of technologies that are very similar and ones that succeeded and ones that failed, right? Classic is Microsoft and Apple. Not that Microsoft failed, but just that Apple had a very unique sense of design, and the company overall had that as its primary, but Apple had to know a lot about design in order to beat out Microsoft. So, it's also not about knowing everything as a technologist. The key is that you want to know how to get things done, which means recruiting other folks to come in. And the way that people do that oftentimes is they have this thing called a red team. And you guys are probably going to do this, I'll figure it out if you're going to do this in one of the upcoming labs. Basically the way that a red team works is that you bring in some outside folks to come in and poke holes in your product or your idea. And you're supposed to do this, right? Because you're kind of playing devil's advocate here. Of course, you're going to stay confidential in doing this, but it also helps you to think a little bit differently, and it helps you to get some outside perspective. Because too often, once your team gets going, you start hitting your head up against the wall. And a lot of times this happens when you're by yourself more than when you're in a team. But you can get so close to a problem that you're not really sure what the solution is. That's why it's important to bring in outside experts. So we'll do some of that. Okay. So you've got your founding team, which is great. But at some point, it's not enough, right? It's not enough to just have 3 or 4 people in the roles that I talked about. You're actually going to need to bring on additional talent. And when we talk about bringing on additional talent, we're talking about recruiting. And the key thing about recruiting, and the way you want to think about it, is that it's a sales process, right? So all of you today, we have this Tech Connect and are getting recruited by various companies, right? And they're coming in, kind of like a sales process, right? They give you some pizza, they tell you about what the company's like, you ask them questions, then hopefully there's some form of interview at the end. But they're really selling you on this idea of working for them. Does that seem like what the process is like, or have things changed? Okay.
That's good.
Yeah. So, what's the one thing that the best salespeople do really well? Anybody know?
Bring pizza.
Okay. Not quite. Yeah.
They can identify what you care about.
Very good. Okay. And then what do they do with that? Once they've identified what you care
They'll
about?
frame what they're saying around that.
They'll frame what? Okay. Right?
Get them to share in your vision. Or
Okay.
go with like a company.
Sure. Anything else?
Like make it sound like you're going to have a lot of responsibility when you join. Or like
Well, I'm
you're
talking about salespeople. Don't think about recruiters. Think about like a car salesman.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Right?
Make you feel good.
Yeah. Sure. So they don't sell, right? They're not sitting there saying, buy this car, right? They're making you feel good, like Nicole said. And like Walter said, they get into your head and they understand what your needs are. And the reason is because really what they're trying to do is they get you to buy the car, right? They're very acting on aspiration and playing up, what's called branding, right? So they're not sitting there saying, buy this car today or else you're going to lose out, right? They're saying, think about all the chicks you can pick up. I don't know, I couldn't think of a better example. Think about all the great places you could go in this car. Yeah. Sorry. So, the classic example, I think, is Mark Benioff, who said, when you think about recruiting people, you really need to think about setting a vision, because that's what people care about. They care about changing the world, right? That's what they're buying into. And I know this is hard when you're like, I just have this little idea, I don't want to paint it so big, and then throw people off, and then they're going to think I'm somehow disingenuous, right? I think that's a lot of times how people feel. They feel like, well, I'll just tell them I'm building this widget, and then they'll know what it is they're getting into, rather than painting this grand vision of how I'm somehow going to change the world when I haven't even gotten out of bed yet, right? So it seems a little bit funny. But the truth is, that's actually what people want to hear. Much like the best salespeople, the customers want to hear that they're going to go to these amazing places in this brand new car, not that they're going to save 2% on their loan, or that it gets, a lot of people care about gas mileage, but overall, most people don't, especially if it's something like a luxury car, right? So, there's actually a process when we think about overall team formation, as well as recruiting and retaining. And the first is, you're going to set up by conveying your vision. And you're going to set up what the criteria is for the people that you're recruiting. And I'll explain what that means. So there's 3 steps to any recruiting process. There's sourcing, right? So company A comes in, brings pizza. That is sourcing. Right? And the second step is, of course, company A saying, hey, we really liked you. We want to interview you. Maybe we'll do a phone screen, or we'll bring you out to wherever we are. And then the final is, if they really like you, then they'll give you an offer, right? These are sort of the 3 main steps. So when we talk about the sourcing phase, the first is that the company has to specify what the position is. And it's not enough to say, hey, we're looking for the biggest, the best and brightest people. They need to also explain what the culture is, and what the skills are, and what's the experience level, right? So obviously, if we're hiring undergrads, that's clear what the experience level is, but then what's the culture like? And then they're going to tell you who the ideal candidate is. But too often in this phase, what people do is when they're identifying the ideal candidate, they think about who matches the position rather than who doesn't match the position. And it's kind of funny to think about it this way, but the reason I say this is because you want to think about who is it that you don't want in your company, right? Who would you say absolutely no to the minute they walked in? Not because you hate their guts or think that they're not human, but just that they wouldn't be the right fit, right? So that's something to think about. So if somebody says, oh, I'm not really interested in personal genomics, well, maybe that's the criteria. They shouldn't be participating because they clearly don't have the interest, right? And it's only going to cause problems later on. The third is you've got to communicate this criteria. So it's not enough for the people who are the hiring managers to know what this is. Everybody needs to know. And the reason everybody needs to know is because everyone is actually involved in the recruiting process, whether they realize it or not. And that means even your referral network. So remember we talked about this, or read about this in the book, I think it's chapter 1, where it says the importance of a referral network. So this is another thing that's really important in the referral network is that you tell everybody who you're looking for, and not only who you're looking for, but who you're not looking for. Okay, so I don't know if any of the recruiters have done this, but a lot of times, they'll come and say, oh, you graduated from Duke, well, I was class of 04, right? They're trying to establish some common ground with you to form a connection. So you've got to do the same thing, right? And a lot of times this can be really helpful. This is a good icebreaker. And then once you've got that connection, then you've got to think about, well, are they actually interested in your idea, right? It's not enough that they say, oh, yeah, I really need a job badly, so I'm going to sign up, right? They've got to be interested in what you're doing. That needs to be a clear smokescreen. And then do they like working on a small team? Remember, you're just getting started, so are they capable of working with just 2 or 3 people, or are they someone who needs to work in a larger setting? And then do you actually like spending time with them, right? Go out and have a conversation, or go do something fun and see if you can actually mesh with these people, because you're going to be working with them for quite a while. So you've got to make sure that they're capable of adapting and growing with your company. Too often people get hired and then within 6 months they realize this isn't what they're interested in, or they weren't capable of working well with other people, or they didn't like the fact that the company suddenly moved from 2 people to 4 people. Like, oh, that's a double in team, so they can't deal with that, right? So you've got to figure those things out. Now, I don't know if any of your companies have done this, but this is something for you to think about. And as you're going through your interview process, it'll be a good way for you to evaluate companies. But see if people actually make you feel comfortable in an interview setting. Because too often what happens is they treat it like it's some sort of test, and it's not meant to be, right? It doesn't have to be a pressure cooker situation. But for some reason, all the interviewers decided that they've got to make the interview process really tough. The truth is, when you make it that tough, you're actually not capable of seeing if someone is able to solve a problem, or they don't actually show what they're capable of, because they're so much under pressure. Then the other thing is to think about what their backgrounds and interests are. And the reason that you want to dig into this is because there might be something in there that they didn't put on their resume that actually shows that they're very interested in what it is that you're doing. And then the third and final is really key. Have them teach you something. Can you explain why I might bring this third point up? Why would you want them to teach you something? What are you?
It shows that they have domain expertise.
Very good. Okay. Yep. They have domain expertise. What else?
You understand how they think about things.
Okay. What else? Anything else? Those are good.
I guess you want to learn the company. They should see if the people there are willing to mentor you or will help you if you ever have problems.
Okay. Good. So, yeah.
And communication skills, are they able to link to it? Can you guys share common ground?
Yep. Perfect. So, Nicole, you all had right answers, but yes, the answer I was looking for was Nicole's, which is communication. Right? So getting them to teach you something actually shows us that they can actually communicate properly, and you can understand what it is that they're teaching you, because you might not even know what that thing is, right? So can they boil it down to a very basic level? Can they be engaging, and would you even want to work with this person, right? If they're not capable of teaching you, they're not going to be able to teach other employees that come. So, once you have the interview, then you've got to set up the criteria. And the key thing about this criteria is it's got to be the same for every candidate you have. You can't judge one candidate differently from the other. So you can't be like, well, the Duke student was like this, but we're going to treat the Harvard kids like that, right? You can't do that. You got to treat everybody the same. So what you're going to look for is, do they demonstrate that they're adaptable? Meaning, can they roll with the punches? And then, of course, are they actually capable of doing the job? And will they do it with a high level of quality? The last two, acknowledging their limits. Why might this be important? Why does somebody need to acknowledge their limits?
So they don't give the false, well, you might need another person in that place. To fill out
Exactly.
the full.
Right, exactly. And then pushes back with poise. Pushes back. Like, why would anybody speak up in an interview? Why is this important?
Because it shows that you're not desperate.
Well, that's true. You're not. Yeah, you're not desperate with something
So
else.
a lot of times it takes, you want this new person to bring in new ideas, and so they should be able to, say, I think the company's doing this, in not the best way.
Right.
Let's do it this way.
Exactly, right? You're trying to bring people in that are going to improve the company. So clearly you don't want a bunch of lemmings. You want people that are going to push back, and you don't want someone that's going to be like, oh, you idiot, right? You want someone to be like, oh, well, this doesn't seem quite right. They're a little bit more diplomatic about it. So, I don't know, once again, if the interviewers that you all have make you solve obscure problems. I certainly had some that did. But I always say, make them solve a real problem, right? Make them solve a problem that relates back to what it is that you're building. Because after all, that's what they're going to be doing on a daily basis. And if they can't do that, then, obviously don't recruit them. But don't ask them why is a manhole cover circle versus a square and all that stuff. Even though it's a really interesting, trivia question, they're not getting recruited for Jeopardy, right? They're getting recruited for your company. So think about it that way. Now, obviously, we're not going to be talking about numbers in this class, but just something for you to think about, once again, as you're getting interviewed, is before you talk numbers, take the time again to sell them on your vision. This is something that too often people don't do, right? They just go straight for the numbers, and then they've lost, once again, the reason why it's important to come work at this organization, or what it is the role is going to have that's going to be so exciting. So, how many of you have crafted an offer before? Okay? Does this seem like a good framework? Okay? So you're going to start with what the role is, right? What might you add that's not on here?
I mean,
It's on.
For advancement?
Okay, good. Yeah.
and benefits that aren't necessarily numbers.
Sure. Perfect. Okay, those are both good answers. Yeah. So you're obviously going to talk about what the role is that they're going to have, how they might grow into it, what might be some other benefits of working here, and then you're going to leave some room for negotiations, right? You're not going to be so hell-bent on a particular outcome. Now, if you want to definitely get rejected, then you're going to give people a low-ball offer, and you're going to give them an aggressive deadline, within 24 hours or else this goes to an MIT student, right? Those kinds of things are complete turn-offs to people. No one's going to respond to it, and you all certainly shouldn't.
Surprisingly, that's what most tech companies actually do. They're like, you have a week.
I think a week is fair. I think that's I don't think it's the best, but I think it's okay because they are trying to move quickly. But yes, 2 weeks is preferable to give people some time. If they give them too longer than that, then they get into this whole shopping around phase, which they want to avoid, which is probably why they're trying to keep it to a week. Then there's, of course, not addressing their needs, right? So if they said something like, well, I've got to work remotely for 1 day a week because I have to do something, and you didn't bother addressing that, then they're going to think that you just don't really care about them. So, a lot of times, I'm sure all of you will do this, and all of you should do this, is you're going to come back and say, well, that's great, but here's what I really want, right? And the key thing, though, is when somebody comes back and gives you a counteroffer, you've got to figure out, does it fit into any of these questions? Because if it did, then it means that you actually haven't done a very good job of recruiting. So if they're asking, what's it like to work at this company, you haven't taken the time to explain how you and your team operate. And then if they ask, well, is there potential for growth or success? Once again, you haven't explained why this company or this idea is so grand and why they're going to miss the opportunity. Or what the opportunity is if they decide to leave their current position. And of course, like Girl said, how are they going to grow? And who they're going to be dealing with on a daily basis. This is actually the most important. A lot of times people want to know, what's their day-to-day going to be like, right? Is my boss going to be breathing down my neck? Or am I going to have the freedom to do things that are exciting and that are challenging? And that's what people want to get a sense of. I'm sure all of you want to get that sense too. This isn't you getting rejected. This is the interviewee rejecting the company, right? So this is when you get the freedom to reject somebody else. And you certainly should, right? But the key thing here is, if someone does reject you and says, I don't want to work at your company, it's not the end of the world, right? It's really the time to then say why. What was it that was unappealing? What is it that we didn't do a good job of explaining to you? Or maybe we just didn't have the money and that's really what you cared about. Well, it's probably not the right place, right? So you gotta let them go. So we've talked a lot about recruiting, right, and the importance of it, but it's not enough to just recruit people, right? You can't just bring people on board and be like, great, now we've got a bunch of brilliant minds, right? You really got to think about the process that you're going to put in place for building. And this is something I want all of you to take the time to think about, and it'll feed into the next week's lab, is what's your process going to be for building this idea that you have. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework here. And the key thing to think about is that your process is actually going to change with time. And it needs to change with time. And the reason it has to change with time is because you're going to get a lot more people coming in. You're going to hopefully grow. You're going to have customers. You're going to have investors. So each time, these new groups of people are coming and going, and each time the business is growing, it's a time for a process to change. And you've got to be agile enough that you're willing to accept those process changes. Right? Too often, companies that will remain unnamed, the reason nobody wants to go work for them is because they say, well, this is the way we've been doing things for the last however many years, and this is how we're going to keep doing things. Nobody wants to work for those places. They're unwilling to change. And that's why people actually end up leaving, and they don't change any of their process until they hit some threshold. So think about the fact that processes will change, and that it's okay. So the next step in this is you're going to put together a process that's going to work for you right now. And you're going to communicate that. And then the other thing is you're going to come up with some way in which you're going to resolve conflict. Right? Because it's going to come up. But it's okay. People are going to push back, hopefully with poise. So I want to give you 2 examples to kind of drill this point home. So when we started at Mint, we were a team of 3. And what it looked like was Aaron sat in his room, and then his roommate Matt, who was the front-end engineer, sat in his room, and then I was the back-end engineer, and I sat in the living room. And basically, Aaron would come in and say, here's the drawing of what the app needs to look like. Matt, build it in JavaScript. Poornima, build the back-end. And that worked for about 2-3 months. And then we brought in our VP of engineering, David. And his real value add was he was a security guy. So immediately he looked at our code and he was like, this isn't secure. No one's going to like this. So we had to do a couple things. The first is obviously we had to rewrite our code base. The next thing we had to do is we had to figure out how we were going to integrate David into the team so that we weren't just fixated on pushing out features, but we were also thinking about security. Right? That was another thing. The next stage was we started to bring in designers, product managers, and so once again, the team had to think about the handoffs that needed to take place, right? How was a designer going to hand an engineer the Photoshop file? How are we going to then incorporate it? How are we then going to release the product? What was marketing going to say? What were the biz dev people going to go do in terms of forming partnerships? So all this coordination started to happen, right? And so as we evolved, our process kept changing. And as this would happen, of course, people would get up in arms about it, but we still kind of kept to the fact that we're adding people and we need to change the process every time we add somebody new. And this is kind of fundamentally what takes place. Now, that of course was one company. Contrast that to BusyBee. The thing that's interesting about BusyBee is, once again, started off with a team of 3 people, very similar. Sat in an apartment, one person in one room, one person in the other room. And for a while, we kind of continued on this cycle of development. And then an interesting thing happened. My co-founder was like, you know what, I'm really sick and tired of driving 2 hours every day to come sit in this apartment and write code. I don't want to do this anymore. Okay, clearly I don't want to lose my co-founder. So the big thing that Alex wanted was to go remote. And at this point, we'd actually had more than 3 people. We had about 5 people. And so I was like, okay, well, I have no idea how to go remote, and I really fear that we won't develop enough product or we'll lose communication, right? So we actually had to systematically put a lot of process in place. And so what that looked like in terms of a remote team was we still had to be present 9 to 5 on chat to answer customer issues. We had to, instead of being able to turn around and ask somebody a question, get on chat and say, hey, I don't understand this design, or if there's a bug in your code. And fortunately, technology had developed enough that we could easily log into GitHub, look at each other's code, and critique it and ask any questions that we wanted to. But we started to function as a remote team, right? And it took a little bit of time to change our process. Now, the reason I bring the story up is because, once again, somebody comes in, they push back, and then you think about, okay, how can we change this process? Now, the other thing is this didn't happen overnight. It actually took us about 6 months to get to a point where we were comfortable in working remotely. The good news is that when we did this, we actually cut down our ship time. So we went from something like shipping product every 2 months to shipping product every 2 weeks. So actually working remotely led us to working faster because we weren't commuting, we weren't dealing with all these other overhead issues, and we were just getting things done. So it was a good process to put in place. Now, the other thing, you're probably wondering, well, if you're doing remote work, then you're probably going to lose out on employees that aren't interested in remote work, right? So that was the other thing that was really important. When we started recruiting people, we told them what our culture was from the very beginning. We said, we're a remote working culture. Sometimes our CEO goes and works in Paris. Sometimes our CTO goes and works somewhere else. Are you comfortable with the fact that you're not going to have somebody sitting right next to you? Some people said, yeah, I'll give it a shot. And some people were like, nope, it's not going to work for me. I need to have my water cooler conversations. I've got to sit in traffic every day. It just makes me feel better. So we realized that wasn't the right employee for us. Right? So you get a sense here of how the culture, the process, all of this fits into recruiting. But the other thing is you can formulate whatever one you want, right? You just got to make sure that everybody's on board and that you're communicating it to new hires. Okay. Any questions? So it's not enough that you have these talented people, right? And it's not enough that you're building. You also have to communicate. This all has to work together and be coordinated. And the key to doing that is you've got to keep people motivated. And one of the ways is to actually keep them communicating with each other. I know I keep saying this, and it seems kind of silly, but I'll explain why it's so important in a minute. So what do you think keeps people from innovating on teams? What do you think is the #1 hurdle when you put a bunch of brilliant minds together, they don't get anything done?
Distraction.
Distraction, okay.
Or
Why
too
what?
much red tape. Too much red tape. Or any of those sort of.
Okay, too much process. Okay, sure.
I was going to say structure.
Structure, okay.
Lack of alignment in the same vision.
Okay. Anything else?
They don't get along.
Okay, they don't get along. Okay. Well, it's actually a number of those things. So have any of you read this book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team? Okay, so Tio has. So the big thing is you actually start with this base of there's an absence of trust, right? You don't get along because you don't really trust each other. And so when you don't trust each other, then you actually end up wasting a lot of time. You don't feel like people are credible. You don't understand your team members' strengths and weaknesses. Then it goes one step further, right? So, Anna said people might not get along, but a lot of times on some teams, you wish that people would actually yell and scream at each other, but sometimes they'll actually engage in this passive-aggressive behavior, where they'll send snarky emails to each other, or they'll try to avoid each other. So conflict can actually be productive, but a lot of times it doesn't even happen. Now, once these two exist, once there's a lack of trust, and then there's this fear of conflict, then there becomes a lack of commitment. right? This is when people start to get sloppy. This is when people start to leave, or they don't show up to meetings, or they just don't care. And the reason is because, too often they feel like they need to have consensus.
Sir, can you just touch on why it's a pyramid? Like why
So it's building upon, so the very top is inattention to results, right? People don't care what the results are. And the reason that they don't care is because of each of these. So at the very base, they've lost trust in each other. And then it builds from there. Make sense? Yes. So, avoidance of accountability, right? Once again, they don't want to speak up against each other. They feel like it's not a culture where they can openly talk about what the issues are. Or they're too focused on individual results. So, whoever the team leader is, whoever's the CEO, right, in your made-up company. So if you ever come to me with a conflict, I'm just going to pull this out and assign one of you as the mediator. But somebody has to step up and do this. So the first is they've got to fix the absence of trust by thinking about people's personal histories and thinking about how to give 360-degree feedback. That's actually meaningful. And you're gonna do that in your final project where you will have to evaluate your teammates honestly. The other is, they actually give people time to resolve conflicts amongst each other. So this doesn't give people a carte blanche to say, oh, I'm the leader, and it seems like you two are arguing, so I'm just going to mediate this, right? You want to let people resolve the issue on their own first, but if they're not willing to, then you can step in. Now, the team leader also has to be okay with making the decision, right? You can't build a consensus all the time. A lot of times we want to, but it's just not possible. And so you have to be okay with being wrong and just letting the team know, hey, I'm going to make an executive decision here, and I realize that I might not be right, and I realize I've taken into consideration all your viewpoints, but we've got to move forward. Now, the next is that you set some clear standards for how you're going to evaluate each other's work, right? So if Anna is showing up late to work, isn't producing, then clearly the teammates are going to say, well, Anna, we have standards here, and the standard is you show up on time and you deliver work that's quality, but you can't just say that, right? What does showing up to work on time mean? Right? It's like, well, I showed up at 10 instead of, 9:59. Doesn't that count? So, make it clear what it means. Doesn't mean you have to be so nitpicky like that, but people should know and be able to understand what you mean by it. It shouldn't be so abstract that you're like, oh, well, we expect you to be here on time. Well, what does that mean? Right? What does being on time mean? And why is it important? And then the final is, it's okay to be focused on results, but you have to also think about all the individuals that are contributing. And too often, that's what ends up getting thrown out. Because you get too result focused, and you forget that this is a compilation of individuals, and each person's contributions actually matter. So, after saying all this, right, like I said at the beginning of the class, sometimes people just have to leave, right? And that's okay. You don't want to keep people against their will, right? You don't want to twist people's arms to stick around. And sometimes they just need to be able to go and work somewhere else. So, why might you want to let somebody go?
Because of family issues.
Okay. What else?
They don't adapt to the culture, or they don't fit in, or
Yeah.
they don't have the skills, or
Yep.
there are a million reasons.
Yeah. And it's okay, you don't have to beat yourself up, right? You're obviously going to have one or two bad hires. The other thing that oftentimes happens is, sometimes people actually are very interested, but then over the course of working, they realize that it wasn't the situation that they thought it was going to be. Maybe they glamorized it in their head, and they're like, oh, I didn't know startup was actually going to be 12 hours. I thought that's just people talked about, right? So, or it might be like, oh, I thought remote working could be cool, but I didn't actually realize that we weren't going to ever, meet until the retreat, right? So sometimes people aren't very good judges, aren't capable of judging their own needs. So it's okay if they need to leave. Now, you guys both said the right thing, right? They're not a culture fit sometimes, or they need a different environment, right? It's not the one that's going to be conducive to them performing really well. They might sometimes say that, hey, I'm actually not getting challenged here a lot, and that they might actually need a place where they can get challenged more, or they're like, oh my god, it's like way too many challenges. I did not sign up for this. I did not sign up to run the whole ship. And like I said, they might just not be interested in the idea. Sometimes they might not be interested in the direction. So my first co-founder left when I switched directions, and she clearly didn't, want to go in that direction anymore, and it was fine. And the reason is because she didn't have the domain expertise to go in that direction, right? And I couldn't necessarily say, no, you got to learn how to do this now, right? So a lot of times people just naturally fall out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a terrible thing. Okay, I keep going. Now, can anybody explain what might happen when somebody leaves, right? So let's say hypothetical situation, Krill, Anna, and Nicole are working, and all of a sudden, Anna's gone. What might happen on the team?
So, like, you need to find somebody to fill the role, but maybe before that, you have to work out, if she has equity, or if he has equity,
That's a good point. That's a really good point, yeah.
what to kind of
Yeah, that's a good
tie
point.
that up.
Right, I talked about that in one of the lectures before.
The most important thing is it can ruin the culture.
Yep, exactly. Does anybody else have anything to add? Yeah.
Maybe a non-compete.
Okay. Oh, that's actually good. I didn't mention that yet. That's a good point. Yeah, you don't want Anna leaving and then starting a personal. What happens?
Trying to give him a high five, he just kind of rejected me.
Yeah, that's true. You don't want her going and starting her own, genomics company. I mean, this happens a lot. You kind of just turn together. Yeah.
Could be like really disorganized. Like if she left without like giving time to train someone else, then like
Sure.
you don't know what she did and figure it out.
Yep. That's true. Yeah, these are all good points. So you don't have time to train the rest of your team. There's not a non-compete. The team, you don't know how much equity she's walking away with. You really affect the culture. So these are all things that you have to think about, before you give somebody the boot. Or even if they decide to, to walk away on their own. These are still things to think about. So the main thing is you've really got to be clear about why somebody left, right? And a lot of times people will be like, we had a irreconcilable difference of blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's fine when your company is 1,000 people. But at the stage that you're at where you're maybe less than 10, sometimes it's okay to dig in a little bit, not a whole lot, right? Talk to your HR person. But you've got to be a bit clear. Very simple story. There was an intern I hired a year ago. This intern, I did not do anything. Not even one thing. Showed up late to every single meeting, scheduled meetings and slept in, and I had to fire her. And then one of my engineers was like, "You're just firing people willy-nilly now?" And then, of course, I had to explain what the context was because he felt like his job was going to be jeopardized and that I was just, going AWOL. So, so make it clear, why someone is leaving. Unfortunately, my marketing person also said, hey, she didn't do anything. It was very clear from the beginning. So don't feel like you're just firing people here, right? Because it does affect the team. What I've noticed is even in the cases where the entire team hates the person, and there's, they can't wait till they leave, there is this loss that happens, and so they're like, oh, this person's gone now. Like, God, I miss him, right? People hated him, right? So that's why I say it's really important. This is the time to kind of regroup, right? And think about, person A is gone. Now we need to think about how this team is going to function. And the other thing is to actually take some time to do some introspection, right? How do we avoid hiring person A again so that we don't get put in this position? Okay, so don't just give them the boot and be like, oh, I'm so glad this person's gone, or let them leave. Take the time to understand what it is, what were the decisions that maybe led to hiring them that weren't quite right. Okay. So, now that we've talked about process for building and communicating, how are we going to retain the people that actually stick around, right? What are some strategies to keep people around? What might you guys want in order to stick around for a company? Okay. Go on. Let's repeat that.
Morale events.
Morale events, okay.
I think just like investing in the people, like whether that be like, if say they want to take a course on something for learning a new skill set or something, like having the company pay for that or something like that. Like,
Did you name Vinay?
yeah.
But Vinay, you don't have time to send you some, class. We gotta like ship our product. Our investors are gonna be like, where's the product?
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, like, what if I'm just saying if it's like...
Oh, Vinay's like out, he's in the MEM program now. So,
No, I'm just saying, like, if there's an online course or something that they wanted to do on their own time, and they're like, oh, would you guys be able to sponsor me to do this? Because it's like some type of programming that we could actually, or like computer language that we don't know, someone on the team doesn't know yet, that we could use in the future. Like, it would be neat if the company would support their initiative to do that.
They just need to make the argument that it will benefit the company in the future. Like, some companies will pay for you to
we're not gonna have a future. We've only got 100K. We gotta build this product and start making money.
I would just leave at that point. No, I'm
Okay.
Challenge them and make them feel like they're actually being challenged. Otherwise, they'll just get bored and leave.
Okay.
If you're going to a startup, you're willing to put up with the horrible hours, so you might as well put up with great vision and something.
But why is it that? True, that's a good point. But why is it that Vinay wants to even go take a class?
I was going to say positive reinforcement, like
Okay.
rewarding them in ways that's not time, it could be
Sure.
money.
But I mean, he's got a real concern. Like he really wants to take this other course, right? He wants to have the freedom to do that. So what is it that he's not getting out of this company that's leading him to want to do this thing on the outside?
It's not being worked hard enough.
I know.
He's not getting enough training, yeah, and he feels like he has to go get it on the outside, right?
That's a good point.
So, you are all right. He does need positive reinforcement, yes, or he's going to leave. Yes, he needs to be challenged. So, yes, these are all important things, but he has a real legitimate concern here, which is, I want to go take this class. Okay, well, why do you want to take the class, right? It's important to dig into this. It is a legitimate concern. So, number one, training and support. Thank you. You must have looked at my slides and set me up for that. This is important. A lot of times people don't put that into their roadmap for onboarding employees. They're just like, oh, you're here, you're a Duke grad, start producing, right? They don't really do that. Most companies have some form of training. But, in a startup, actually, you kind of have to start producing. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can't take the time to learn a little bit or learn as you're going. But the key is, despite what size of organization you are, there's always got to be some room for training and support. And this also means not just formal training, but this means that each employee needs to be able to train each other. So there's got to be some level of redundancy, right? So the things that Anna knows, Carol should know, and Nicole should know as well. It shouldn't just be that she knows how to do this one particular thing. Now, the other is clear evaluation criteria for progress, right? So it's not enough to say, this is a really shitty thing that you did. This is a really bad thing that you did, right? You've got to explain why it's bad and give them some clear standards, okay? And then acknowledge, like you all mentioned, acknowledge their efforts, acknowledge their accomplishments. And the most important is celebrating the milestones. Okay, so morale. Keeping the morale up. Even if it's as simple as like, let's go get beers, hopefully we're all overage here, then let's do it, right? But not taking the time and then just being so results oriented and kind of keeping moving forward isn't enough. That's why people burn out. Because they feel like they're not getting recognized, they're working all the time, and they don't have any sort of morale to keep them excited and motivated. Make sense? So, let's recap here. So why do we need a team? What's the reason we need a team? You kind of beat this.
You're never good enough.
Okay, you're never good enough, yes.
That's what we're going with.
Not that you're never good enough. It's that you have what you have, which is good enough, but you're going to need more help, you're going to need more support. Now, when's the right time to assemble a team? When you actually, your first team, your founding team, not the people afterwards, but the first team.
When you have work for them to do.
Okay, when you have work for them to do, sure. And then we talk about how do you assemble this team, right? How do you get them going? What are the kind of 4 things that you need? Quiz question.
innovator.
Yep.
Technologist, investor.
Yep. And what's the big thing that has to happen in this team? Okay? We have to think about culture and communication. And then how are you going to manage the team and keep them motivated and moving forward? Okay, for Gorilla Pizza. I hope you ladies are ready for some pizza.
Specific goals.
Specific goals, yep. Okay.
Training and support if that's necessary.
Right, okay. And then finally, somebody decides to leave. There's the door. Right? What do we need to do before we show them the door?
Ask them why.
Ask them why, okay.
Communicate to the other employees.
Okay. Is there ever a time where you maybe don't want someone to leave?
Need them.
Well, yes, you need them, sure.
Maybe you're about to embark, or you're kind of in the process of a large kind of make or break situation for the company, and you don't have time to look for somebody else that might have that skill set to be able to at least get that process
So
going.
if you're getting like funding and your chief technologist leaves,
Yeah.
that'll look kind of bad.
Sure. But, I mean, let's assume that they're like, I really don't like it here.
Try to remedy the situation.
Okay, very good. Yes,
That's
try
the
to
time.
read the situation. Clearly, this person is smart, who's your chief technology officer. Hopefully, he or she isn't so off base, right? And there might actually be something wrong in your culture. So you go back to that pyramid and you say, okay, I'm the CEO or whomever, and I really want to keep this person on board, because I think they're going to make a big contribution, and they also have some valid points to bring up. Okay, so don't always show people the door. Think about what it is you're doing wrong on the inside, right? Because there could be something that is wrong that has to be corrected. So no amount of people that you churn through will change that. So you've got to think about, are we in the wrong here, and is there time to change the process, and will it make things better? I actually had this situation happen to me when I started BusyBee, where my first engineer, after I think 3 or 4 months, decided to leave. And he had a good point in that I wasn't clearly paying enough attention to his needs, and neither was my co-founder. And we were, in the wrong, so we decided to remedy the situation, and he's basically been with me ever since. So, was able to turn things around. So yes, it is important to kind of take stock. All right?